In this lesson, we'll be discussing infectious diseases of the skin. So first, an overview of the basic anatomy of the skin. So the skin can be divided into various different layers. The innermost layer of the skin is the subcutaneous tissue, which is essentially the insulation layer. This is basically just adipose tissue. In the middle here, we have the dermis. The dermal layer has a lot of the very important material, so it is where we're going to have the blood vessels, the sweat glands, the oil ducts, all those types of things. And then the outermost layer here is the epidermis. If you remember from going through 210 to 11, the epidermis is a layer of the skin composed of epidermal cells, which is able to regenerate. So the epidermal cells are made on the inner portion here and then eventually are pushed outward. The outermost layer of the epidermis is a layer that is known as the stratum corneum, where you basically have dead skin cells. This particular layer is important for microbiology because that outermost layer of the epidermis, where the dead skin cells are, those cells are impregnated with keratin, which makes our skin quite tough and durable and resistant to things like microbial penetration. So these are the various layers of the skin. Some infectious microbes target some areas of the skin, whereas others target different layers. So for example, something like chickenpox and shingles, which are caused by the varicella zoster virus, those lesions that we get as a result of those infections target the epidermal layer, this outer layer here. And because the epidermis is able to regenerate itself, even though you get lesions with things like chickenpox and shingles, it doesn't typically lead to permanent scarring because they're in this outermost layer that regenerates itself. Something like smallpox. Smallpox targets the deeper layers of the skin, the dermal layer. So when smallpox has been eradicated, but when individuals got smallpox, if they would survive the smallpox infection, they typically would have scars on their body where the lesions were present for the rest of their life. And again, that's because the virus attacks this deeper layer of the skin that does not regenerate itself, so any damage would typically result in scarring. So this is just a basic, very general review of the anatomy of the skin. I'm not going to test you specifically on anatomy, so you're not going to have to label layers or anything like that, but it's just important to have a general understanding of these layers before we start the various different infectious pathogens. So one of the first things we'll talk about are the different defenses that our skin has that protects us against infection. We went over some of these in our host defense lessons, but just as a review, the skin is a natural barrier to microbial infection, and that is assuming that the skin is intact. As long as our skin is intact, it is resistant to most microbial infections. That keratinized surface in the stratum corneum, the dead skin cells that are impregnated with keratin, that surface makes it resistant to things like abrasion, water penetration, damage, microbial invasion. So as long as the skin is kept intact, it's a really good defense towards microbes. Obviously, if there's any type of break in the skin from, a cut or a burn, then the skin is no longer intact and it makes it quite easy for a microbe to get in and cause an infection. But most microorganisms are not able to cause an infection if they're just on the skin. If they get in the skin, that's a different case. But if they're just on the skin, they're not able to cause an infection. Now, there are some exceptions to the rule. There are some microorganisms that are flesh-eating, but those are relatively rare and again are not really, they're just more of an exception. We also have the continuous shedding of our skin, which we call the sloughing of the skin. So that outermost layer out here, the epidermis, it is continuously regenerated. So within the epidermal layer, new skin cells are created, and then the older skin cells are pushed outward until they get up into the stratum corneum. And then eventually those dead skin cells are shed or sloughed off. This typically will cause the epidermis to be replaced every 25 to 45 days. But that continuous shedding of the epidermal cells, that does kind of mechanically remove potentially pathogenic microorganisms as well. Because you have to think, if those bad microorganisms are on the skin and you're continuously shedding off of those old skin cells, that is going to physically take some of the potentially pathogenic microbes with them. So some physical defenses would be things like the keratinized surface that makes our skin tough and durable, and and it makes it able to withhold against various different types of microorganisms and abrasions. And then also the sloughing of the skin cells that removes dead skin cells and potentially pathogenic microbes as well. We also have various chemical defenses that are secreted by the skin. So one being antimicrobial peptides. Antimicrobial peptides are simply just chemicals that our skin secretes. They are positively charged chemicals, and because they have a positive charge and all bacteria have a negative charge due to their cell membranes, the antimicrobial peptides will be able to bind to bacteria. And when they do so, they essentially are going to destroy the cell membranes of bacteria. So antimicrobial peptides use their positive charge to bind to negatively charged bacterial cell membranes and destroy their cell membranes, which causes the bacterial cells to shrivel and die. Our skin also releases oils called sebum, and typically what happens is the good bacteria on your skin, the normal biota, will actually feed off of the skin oils, and when they do that, it causes acids to be released, and that gives your skin an overall acidic pH. Most microorganisms do not thrive in a low pH. They tend to prefer a neutral pH. So because your skin has an acidic pH due to this process, it makes it a harsh environment for most pathogenic bacteria. So for most pathogenic bacteria, if they would land on the skin, they would not be able to thrive in that low pH, that acidic environment. But again, there are obviously exceptions to the rule. Staphylococcus is able to cause a variety of skin infections, and it is a bacteria that is able to survive in low pH. But generally, most bacteria are not able to survive in an acidic environment. A few more chemical defenses are things like sweat. So obviously, we secrete sweat from sweat glands on our skin. Sweat is slightly acidic, so that again also kind of contributes to the low pH of the skin. But more importantly, sweat has a high salt concentration, and we know that most bacteria do not prefer to live in an environment where there's a high salt concentration, because it creates a hypertonic environment, and the bacteria will shrivel up and die. The exception to that rule is Staphylococcus. Staphylococcus loves salt. They are halophilic, and that's why they're one of the leading causes of skin infections. But in general, most bacteria would not be able to survive on the skin because of the hypertonic environment created by salt. And then lastly, lysozyme. We've mentioned lysozyme before, but lysozyme is an enzyme that's found in sweat, tears, and saliva. So because of its presence in sweat, it is important to talk about in the skin infections lesson. Lysozyme is an enzyme that basically breaks down the cell walls of bacteria. Specifically, it destroys peptidoglycan in the cell wall. If a bacterial cell's cell wall is destroyed, it can no longer maintain its structure and support, and it will basically burst through cell lysis. We also have normal biota on our skin. There are certain regions of our body where we have normal biota and then some where we don't, but the skin is exposed entirely to the external environment, so it gets continuously cultivated with good or beneficial microorganisms that we know as normal biota. Various different types of fungi and bacteria are present and have beneficial roles on the skin. You definitely have more on areas of your body that are prone to moisture and less on areas of your body that are more dry, but consistently you have some type of normal biota pretty much over the entire surface of your skin. And we talked in previous lessons about how the normal biota can make a harsh environment for potentially pathogenic bacteria. That concept is known as microbial antagonism. So normal biota are very important on the skin. All right, so we're going to be talking about various different skin infections. And one of the predominant signs that we see with skin infections are the presence of some type of rash. So we're going to talk throughout the lesson about 3 different types of rashes. Macupapular being the first type. We're also going to talk about vesicular rashes and pustular rashes. So macupapular rashes are rashes that have a flat to slightly raised colored appearance. By colored appearance, I mean it will typically have a pink to red coloration. There are a variety of different microorganisms that cause diseases that lead to a macupapular rash. I have stars next to measles and rubella because those are the 2 that we are going to focus on in this lesson. If you contract measles, you get a red rash. Rubella typically leads to a flat pink rash. But there are other infectious diseases that we'll talk about later on in the semester that also create macupapular rashes. For example, scarlet fever is a complication of a streptococcus infection. It typically does produce a red rash on the skin. Individuals that get Zika, possibly through an infected mosquito bite, typically do get a macular rash. Hand, foot, and mouth disease, which is common in small children, leads to lesions, typically, obviously, on the hands, on the feet, and the mouth. And these lesions are relatively mild, although they are somewhat painful and itchy, but they usually resolve themselves in a few weeks. But collectively, all of these diseases produce macupapular rashes, which again are just rashes that have a flat to slightly raised appearance and offer some type of color ranging again between kind of pink and red. So the first one we're going to talk about is measles. So as far as the causative agent, it's fairly easy. Measles is caused by a virus, and that virus is known as the measles virus. Measles is a highly contagious disease. There is a 90% chance that you will get infected with measles if you are exposed to someone that actively has measles. And again, that's assuming that you have not been vaccinated and have not had measles prior to exposure, because obviously in those cases you would have immunity. But it is highly contagious. The reason why it's highly contagious is because it is transmitted through respiratory droplets. So if someone has measles, when they cough, sneeze, or speak, those mucus droplets will be released. Those mucus droplets will have thousands and thousands of copies of the measles virus within it. And if you inhale one of those droplets, you are obviously going to become exposed to the measles virus and potentially contract measles. So what are the signs and symptoms of measles? Generally, when you first get infected with the measles virus, you will start to experience some nonspecific signs and symptoms. Because of the respiratory transmission, you will likely have something like a sore throat, potentially a cough, headache, fever, nauseous, fatigue, those kind of really standard nonspecific signs or symptoms. It's not necessarily important for you to memorize the nonspecific signs and symptoms because those things are common for a variety of different diseases. I mean, yes, we see those types of things with measles, but we also see them with things like influenza, COVID, strep throat. So they really are nonspecific, and what we want to focus more on are the more specific signs and symptoms that we would only expect in cases where individuals had measles.